November 22nd, 1963. Frank Sinatra was in a recording studio when he heard the news. President Kennedy had been shot. He stopped mid-song, walked out, and didn't speak for 3 days. What did Frank know? The recording engineer saw it first. He was adjusting levels, watching Frank through the glass booth when someone burst through the door. "Turn on the radio, now!" Frank was in the middle of I Have Dreamed, his voice wrapping around the melody with that effortless control he was famous for. But when the engineer held up his hand, "Stop," Frank stopped. He pulled off his headphones and looked through the glass. "What's wrong?" The engineer turned up the radio. A newscaster's voice filled the studio, shaking, urgent. "We have confirmed reports from Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy has been shot. His condition is unknown at this time. I repeat, the president has been shot." Frank stood perfectly still. The microphone hung in front of him, forgotten. The orchestra behind him went silent. Everyone in that studio froze, trying to process what they'd just heard. Then Frank set down his headphones, walked out of the recording booth, and kept walking, past the engineers, past the musicians, out of the building. He didn't say a word. He just left. His driver was waiting outside. "Take me home," Frank said. His voice was flat, empty. "Boss, you okay?" "Just drive." The drive from the recording studio to Frank's compound in Palm Springs normally took him 2 hours. Frank didn't remember any of it. He sat in the back of the car, staring out the window, seeing nothing. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere dangerous. Because Frank Sinatra knew things about John F. Kennedy that most people didn't. He knew about Kennedy's connections to organized crime. He knew about the role Sam Giancana had played in Kennedy's 1960 election. He knew about the promises that had been made and the promises that had been broken. And now Kennedy was dead, shot in Dallas. And Frank couldn't stop thinking about all the conversations he'd overheard, all the meetings he'd arranged, all the favors that had been called in. Frank couldn't stop thinking about Sam Giancana saying just 6 months ago that Kennedy betrayed us. Someone should do something about that. Frank had laughed it off at the time. Sam was always making threats, always talking tough. It didn't mean anything. But now Kennedy was dead, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Sam's threat had meant something after all. When Frank got home, he locked himself in his study. He poured a drink, scotch. He normally didn't drink scotch. He preferred Jack Daniels, but that day he needed something stronger. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the phone on his desk, wondering if it would ring, wondering if someone would call to explain, to reassure, to tell him this was just a coincidence. The phone didn't ring. 3 days later, they arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. 2 days. After that, Jack Ruby shot Oswald on live television, and suddenly everyone was talking about conspiracy theories, about mob involvement, about whether this was bigger than one lone gunman. Frank watched it all on television and said nothing, absolutely nothing. His friends called. Dean Martin called, worried. "Frank, you okay? You haven't left the house in days." "I'm fine, Dean." "You don't sound fine. You want company?" "No, I just need time." But it wasn't time Frank needed. It was answers. And the only people who had answers were people Frank couldn't ask, people who wouldn't talk, people who, if they were involved, would never admit it. To understand what Frank knew, you have to go back to 1960, the presidential election. John F. Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, and the race was close, painfully close. Every vote mattered. Every state mattered. And there were certain states, Illinois, West Virginia, where organized crime had significant influence. Frank Sinatra had connections to both worlds. He was friends with the Kennedys. He'd campaigned for JFK, raised money, used his celebrity to bring in votes. But Frank was also friends with Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss who controlled union votes, who could influence elections, who could deliver Illinois to Kennedy if he chose to, and Sam chose to. In 1960, Sam Giancana helped deliver Illinois to John F. Kennedy. The margin was razor thin, less than 9,000 votes, but it was enough. And many people believed that without Chicago, without Sam's influence, Kennedy wouldn't have won. Frank had been the bridge. He'd arranged meetings between Sam and Kennedy's people. He'd passed messages. He'd made promises on behalf of the Kennedys, promises that the new administration would go easy on organized crime, that certain investigations would be dropped, that certain favors would be returned. But once Kennedy was in office, everything changed. Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, and instead of backing off, he launched the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in American history. Wiretaps, raids, indictments. The Kennedys weren't just ignoring their promises to the mob, they were actively trying to destroy the mob. Sam Giancana was furious. He felt betrayed. He delivered Illinois. He'd helped make JFK president, and this was how the Kennedys repaid him? In the spring of 1963, Sam called Frank. "We need to talk." They met at a private club in Chicago. Sam was pacing, angry, barely containing his rage. "The Kennedys lied to us, Frank. They used us, and now they're coming after us. Bobby Kennedy has the FBI tapping my phones. They're following me everywhere. They're trying to put me in prison." "Sam, what do you want me to do? I don't have that kind of influence with them anymore." That was true. Frank's relationship with the Kennedys had deteriorated badly. In 1962, JFK was supposed to stay at Frank's compound in Palm Springs. Frank had built a helipad specifically for the presidential visit. He'd renovated rooms, installed secure phone lines, prepared everything, and then, 2 days before the visit, the Kennedys canceled. Not postponed, canceled. JFK stayed at Bing Crosby's house instead. The reason, though never stated publicly, was clear. Bobby Kennedy didn't want his brother associating with Frank Sinatra because of Frank's mob connections, the same mob connections that had helped get JFK elected. Frank was devastated. He felt used, betrayed, humiliated. He'd gone all in for the Kennedys, and they'd thrown him away like he was nothing. So when Sam said, "The Kennedys betrayed us," Frank understood exactly what Sam meant, because Frank had been betrayed too. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked carefully. Sam looked at him with cold, calculating eyes. "Someone needs to teach them a lesson. Someone needs to remind them that you don't betray the people who put you in power." "Sam, be careful. These are dangerous words. These are dangerous times, Frank." That conversation haunted Frank after the assassination. Had Sam been serious? Had that been a threat, or just venting? And if it had been a threat, had Sam actually followed through? Frank didn't know, but he suspected, and that suspicion terrified him. In December 1963, the Warren Commission began its investigation into Kennedy's assassination. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, tried to piece together what had happened in Dallas, and they wanted to talk to Frank Sinatra. The FBI agent who came to Frank's house was polite but firm. "Mr. Sinatra, we need to ask you some questions about your relationship with President Kennedy and certain organized crime figures." "What organized crime figures?" "Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Santo Trafficante. We understand you have relationships with these individuals. I know them. That doesn't mean I'm involved in anything. We're not suggesting you are, Mr. Sinatra, but we believe these individuals may have had motive and opportunity to be involved in the president's assassination, and we need to understand the extent of their connections to the Kennedy administration." Frank's lawyer, who was sitting next to him, spoke up. "My client doesn't have to answer these questions. We're not forcing him to answer, but we would appreciate his cooperation." Frank looked at the agent for a long moment. Then he said, "I have nothing to say." "Mr. Sinatra, I have nothing to say," Frank repeated, his voice harder now. "I didn't kill President Kennedy. I don't know who did, and I'm not going to speculate about my friends." The agent tried several more times, asking about specific meetings, specific conversations, specific connections between the mob and the Kennedys, but Frank refused to answer. Not because he was protecting the mob, and not because he was protecting himself. Frank refused to answer because he genuinely didn't know what the truth was. He suspected Sam might have been involved. He suspected there were connections he didn't fully understand, but he didn't have proof. And Frank wasn't going to accuse anyone, not even Sam Giancana, of assassinating the president based on suspicion alone. The Warren Commission eventually concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, no mob involvement, just one troubled man with a rifle. But Frank didn't believe it. Neither did a lot of other people. The evidence seemed too convenient, the explanations too simple, and the people who might have had real answers, people like Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Santo Trafficante, they all said nothing. In 1965, Frank was performing at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami when Sam Giancana showed up backstage. It was the first time they'd spoken face-to-face since Kennedy's assassination. "Sam, Frankie." They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Sam said, "You've been avoiding me." "I've been busy." "Too busy for an old friend?" "Sam, what do you want?" Sam stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I heard the FBI came to talk to you about Dallas." "They did. What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I told them nothing because I don't know anything." Sam studied Frank's face, looking for deception, looking for weakness. "That's good, Frank. That's real good, because some things are better left unknown. You understand?" Frank understood perfectly. Sam was telling him to stay quiet, not as a threat, exactly, more as advice from from a friend. Some doors once opened could never be closed. Some questions once asked would haunt you forever. I understand, Sam. Good. Sam clapped Frank on the shoulder. We're okay then. You and me. We're still friends. Yeah, Sam. We're still friends. But they weren't. Not really. That friendship had died in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. It had died with Kennedy, because from that moment on, Frank would always wonder, and Sam would always know that Frank was wondering. Years passed. The Warren Commission report gathered dust. The conspiracy theories multiplied. New evidence emerged, was debated, was dismissed. And through it all, Frank Sinatra remained silent. He performed. He recorded albums. He lived his life. But he never talked about Dallas. He never talked about Kennedy. And he never talked about what he might have known. In 1975, Sam Giancana was murdered in his home in Chicago, shot 7 times in the back of the head while cooking sausages in his kitchen. The killer was never found, but the timing was suspicious. Sam was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders, plots that Sam had been involved in. And suddenly, days before his testimony, Sam was dead. When Frank heard the news he was performing in Las Vegas, someone told him between shows. Frank nodded, thanked them for letting him know, and went back to his dressing room. He sat there alone for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. Dean.
Martin found him there. Frank, you okay? Sam's dead. I heard. I'm sorry. He was going to testify about the CIA, about Cuba, about everything. I know. And now he's dead. Convenient timing, don't you think? Dean didn't answer. What could he say? They killed him, Dean. Someone killed him to shut him up because he knew too much about Dallas, about Kennedy, about all of it. Frank, you don't know that. I know, Dean. I don't have proof, but I know. Just like I know who really killed Kennedy. Just like I know why. I've always known. I just can't prove it. And even if I could prove it, who would I tell? Who would believe me? Who would do anything about it? Dean sat down next to his friend. Then let it go, Frank. Whatever you know, whatever you suspect, let it go. It's over. Kennedy's dead. Sam's dead. Nothing you say or do will change that. Frank looked at Dean with eyes that seemed older than they should have been. I can't let it go, Dean, because every time I sing My Way, every time I talk about living without regrets, I think about Dallas. I think about the phone calls I arranged, the meetings I set up, the bridge I built between Kennedy and the mob. And I wonder, did I help make that assassination happen? Was I part of it without even knowing? You didn't pull the trigger, Frank. Maybe not. But did I load the gun? That question haunted Frank for the rest of his life. He carried it with him through every performance, every interview, every quiet moment alone. The question of what he knew, what he suspected, and what he could never prove. In 1977, Johnny Roselli, another mob figure connected to both the Kennedy assassination theories and the CIA's Cuban plots, was found murdered. His body was stuffed in an oil drum floating off the coast of Miami. Like Sam, Johnny had been scheduled to testify. Like Sam, Johnny died before he could talk. Frank read about it in the newspaper and felt a chill run down his spine. Everyone who knew the truth was dying. Everyone who could confirm or deny the theories, everyone who had been there, everyone who understood the connections, they were all being eliminated. And Frank wondered, was he next? He knew things, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to be dangerous, enough to be a liability. But nothing happened to Frank. No mysterious accidents, no sudden illnesses. Maybe he didn't know as much as he thought. Or maybe, and this thought terrified him even more, maybe the people who were cleaning up loose ends didn't consider Frank a threat because they knew he'd never talk. They knew Frank's loyalty. They knew he'd take his secrets to the grave. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, mandating that all government records related to the assassination be reviewed and released by 2017. Thousands of documents were declassified, FBI files, CIA files, witness testimonies that had been sealed for decades, and in those files, Frank Sinatra's name appeared. Again and again and again. 71 times in the CIA documents alone. References to his relationships with mob figures. References to his connections to Kennedy. References to meetings and phone calls and conversations that suggested Frank had been far more involved in the intersection of politics
politics and organized crime than anyone publicly knew. But Frank never saw those documents. He died in 1998, 19 years before they were released to the public. He died without ever publicly addressing the conspiracy theories, without ever confirming or denying what he knew, without ever providing the answers that so many people desperately wanted. At Frank's funeral, one of his closest friends spoke about Frank's relationship with Kennedy. Frank loved Jack Kennedy. He campaigned for him, raised money for him, believed in him, and when Jack cut him off, when the Kennedys decided Frank was too dangerous to associate with, it broke something in Frank. He never really trusted anyone in power after that. He always assumed they'd use him and throw him away. The friend paused, looking at Frank's casket. But here's what I know about Frank. Whatever he knew about Dallas, whatever he suspected, he never said a word. Not because he was protecting the mob, and not because he was afraid, but because Frank understood that some truths are too dangerous to speak out loud. Some truths would destroy more than they would reveal. And Frank chose silence not as a cover-up, but as an act of mercy. Mercy for the Kennedy family. Mercy for the country. Mercy for everyone who wanted to believe that America wasn't capable of something that dark. Maybe that's true. Maybe Frank's silence was noble. Or maybe it was just self-preservation. Maybe Frank kept quiet because speaking up would have implicated him, would have revealed his role as the bridge between two worlds that should never have touched. We'll never know for certain. The people who could tell us are all dead now. Kennedy, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Frank Sinatra. The secrets died with them. But the questions remain. Did the mob kill Kennedy? Did Sam Giancana order the hit? Was Frank Sinatra involved in any way? Or was it really just Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, with no conspiracy, no connection to organized crime? The official answer is that Oswald acted alone. But 50 years of investigation, thousands of hours of testimony, millions of pages of documents haven't convinced everyone. The theories persist. The doubts remain. And somewhere in all of that uncertainty, Frank Sinatra's silence speaks volumes. Not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to say. Not because of what he admitted, but because of what he never denied. On November 22, 1963, Frank Sinatra heard the news that President Kennedy had been shot. He stopped mid-song, walked out of the studio, and didn't speak for 3 days. And in that silence, in that 3-day vigil of grief, or guilt, or knowing, Frank Sinatra became part of
the mystery he could never solve, and the truth he could never tell. What did Frank know? We'll never be certain, but we know he knew something, and we know that whatever it was, it haunted him for the remaining 35 years of his life. Sometimes the most powerful truth isn't what someone says, it's what they choose not to say. And Frank Sinatra chose silence. Absolute, deliberate, permanent silence. That silence tells us everything and nothing. It confirms suspicions and proves nothing. It suggests knowledge and admits to none. It's the perfect crime of information, the secret kept so well that it becomes indistinguishable from innocence. November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was shot. Frank Sinatra walked out of a recording studio and into a silence that would last the rest of his life. And somewhere in that silence lies a truth that may never be known, a connection that may never be proven, a story that died with the only man who could tell it. What did Frank know? Everything, nothing, something. The answer died in 1998 when Frank took his final breath. The question remains.